Thank you, Jamie. Thank you for having me here. I'm sorry that you had such a short break in between, but now that you're all interested in economics and market-based instruments, we're going to continue in that vein. I'll just give you a little bit of background on who I am. As Jamie said, my name is Sabina Shaikh. I am an economist here on the faculty in public policy and environmental studies. So I teach environmental economics, environmental policy, and general economics and public policy courses. I also work as a research economist for a consulting firm in town, and I do almost exclusively environmental policy work. So market-based instruments, economic incentives, look at setting up different types of mechanisms. Cap and trade is the type of program we work on. Payments for environmental services. I was just out in LA giving a talk on energy efficiency and how that's related to the price of energy and the price of carbon. So we'll talk a little bit about carbon pricing. And also I do a lot of regional work on Great Lakes and a little bit different in terms of evaluating economic benefits from restoration and remediation, protection of Great Lakes, water supply issues. Certainly we've all heard a lot about water and the supply of water. And so those are the kinds of things I do, kind of broad spectrum of air, water, land, and other types of things. So if you have any questions at all, I'm going along, please stop me. I've made it kind of broad, as you can tell by the title, kind of encompassing a lot of different things. I think the last talk was pretty specific, so I'm going to keep it fairly broad. I won't say as much or very little about emissions trading, because I think you've just heard about that. And I think you're going to hear about China in the next talk, so I'll try to just say a little bit about that as well. Hopefully we don't all disagree with each other as we go on. I will say a few words about a carbon tax, which I just think you heard a little bit quickly from Mike Walsh about that. And we've certainly talked about it as well. But there's support for both types of programs. So what I would like to do is just know a little bit about all of you. In the interest of time, I guess I'll just ask quickly what fields you're in. How many science teachers do we have here? Okay, biology, physical science? Okay, and you all can inform me as I go along about the science implications here. What about social sciences? Okay, great. Any economics teachers? Oh, okay. That's okay. I didn't like economics in high school or even in the beginning of college, and then I fell in love with it, I guess, later. What about humanities? And humanities, arts? Great. Okay, so we have a great range here, and I will be talking mostly about economics. Obviously, there's some political issues here, and I know I already met one political science teacher, and I think there's probably a few more in here. So let me just get started. I'll just give you a little bit of background of what I'm going to talk about. I don't know, I missed the beginning of Mike's talk, so I don't know how much he said about just economic models for pollution control. I'll just say a little bit about that in terms of, what is the economic justification for government intervention in environmental protection? Okay, so here at the University of Chicago, our economics department is sort of famous or notorious for advocating free markets and little government intervention. So, what are we doing with pollution control, and what kind of economic models are we using? Then get into global climate policy. How much have you heard in the last 2 days about the Kyoto Protocol? Nothing? Oh, okay. Well, I have about 2 slides on it, but we can talk a little bit more about that. And I think you'll probably hear more about it as you start hearing about other developing countries in particular. Leveling the playing field. So this is what you just heard about, putting a price on carbon, whether you do it through capping the amount of carbon or actually just assigning a price through a carbon tax. How does this work within the market? Okay, so the economy. What are the demand and supply responses to a higher price of carbon? So supply responses in terms of substitution to renewables or alternative fuels, and the demand responses. What is a demand response into an increased price? Demand response is usually a drop in consumption or drop in production, you could think of as well. So we'll look at that in terms of energy efficiency. Okay, this is there's a lot of focus in the media and in policy on increasing our supply of energy or of oil, or changing the supply, the mix of inputs into supply. But what about improving our energy efficiency? Okay, and this doesn't necessarily mean shutting off all the lights and sitting in the dark. This means, improving our buildings and our homes and our cars and just using less energy, per unit of output. You could imagine it. So talk a bit about that, and then some uncertainties and recommendations. So there's a lot here. Kind of go through it one by one. I tried to keep it broad and cover a lot of different bases, just because economics, it's kind of tied to a lot of different things. Certainly, if you need me to go into more specifics, feel free to interrupt, or I'll leave some time at the end for questions as well. So, fun economic concepts from today. Has everybody here had an economics course? How many people have never had an economics course? Few people. Okay, so basically when you start Econ 101, you go supply, demand, price, and quantity. Okay, that's about where you are. We're going to throw in some fun concepts in economics that are a little bit more based in behavior and sort of predictions of behavior, rational behavior, and what happens when people don't behave in the way that you might imagine. So we've got a couple concepts which have sort of fun names that may mean something or nothing to you right now, but externalities, moral hazard, which people may have heard about, the prisoner's dilemma, which is a game that's modeled, game theory of economics, discount rates, which whether you know the terminology or not, we all have a discount rate, and principal agent problems is another thing that I'll go into. So it's a good way to sort of communicate some of these more advanced economic topics with respect to climate change and climate policy. So as far as the economics of pollution control, you may have heard a little bit from Mike already. So the idea that you may hear is that government intervention into the free market or into the economy tends to lead to inefficiency, or it leads to something we call dead weight loss, which is a burden from taxing or things like that. The thing about that, though, is that that's not always the case. Sometimes the market just fails on its own. Okay, so sometimes we've got supply and demand and we don't reach some equilibrium for other reasons. And in that case, when that happens, then we use government intervention to fix the problem. Okay, so that's where we are here. Something called externalities is market failure. How many people have heard of the phrase externality? Okay, and I've actually noticed it used a lot more within just, in the media, in the New York Times and Time Magazine and Newsweek. As far as, this is an economic concept that justifies intervention or pollution control. The idea is that for any private entity, considering the private costs and private benefits of production or consumption, there's something missing from that. Okay, so a private decision does not reflect the social cost or the true cost. An example would be in consumption would be smoking. Okay, your decision to smoke a cigarette or somebody's decision to smoke a cigarette may not take into account the effect that it affects the person sitting next to you. Okay, so there's this external cost that doesn't go into your decision-making process. Same thing with pollution. Okay, these are forms of what we call negative externalities. In this case, Adam Smith said everybody acting in their own self-interest, private consumers, private suppliers, leads to the greatest overall societal benefit. That's not the case, though, if your behavior imposes costs on other people, if you didn't intend it to. This can be a negative externality. Pollution is the most classic example. We also have positive externalities. In this case, you make a decision to do something and it benefits other people. Can anyone think of an example? Yeah.
Planting a garden.
Planting a garden, great example, right? So your garden, maybe your neighbor has a view of the garden and they can smell the flowers, they can see it. Maybe bees come and pollinate their flowers as well. That's a perfect example. Another one that sometimes people call a positive externality or a public good is education. Your education makes other people better off, eventually, hopefully. So those are externalities. It can be negative or positive. We're focusing on negative. You could turn this around and you could say something like using coal has negative externalities in the form of pollution, healthcare costs and visibility and whatever else. You could turn it around and say that solar energy then has a positive externality in the removal of pollution, or in the replacing coal or replacing the emissions from coal. One example, and this was, I took this quote right from an article that was in the New York Times recently. Driving is too cheap, right? So according to economists, the market works. How could something be too cheap? You know, you see a market price. Driving is too cheap. We've heard energy is too cheap. Water is too cheap. What do we mean by that is that when you make the decision to drive, what are you factoring into your decision? Whether, yeah, the substitution possibility and how convenient that is, right? So there may be trains and buses, but it takes 5 times as long or something. So you're taking into account how long is it going to take me to get there, how much is it going to cost me in gas, is there parking, all of these things that affect your decision. You may think about what time it is and how many other people will be on the road. Okay, so, but what you may not be taking into account, some people do, some people don't, is the pollution from your driving versus walking. The congestion that you being on the road imposes on other people, the increased accident rates. So these are all externalities. That's the argument for a congestion pricing is something that people are talking about. That just failed in New York, but they use in London quite well. That driving is too cheap. You can make the same argument for energy. If you go, last summer I was in Miami in the middle of summer, and you know what it's like in Miami in the middle of summer. It's hot, it's humid, and I remember walking down the street and the doors to all the businesses are wide open and there's cold blasts of air. So you actually have to walk a little bit further away unless you want to get blasted with cold air as you're walking. And my friend said to me, I think energy is too cheap, right? Otherwise the doors wouldn't be wide open with the air conditioning blasting. So that's kind of the argument that we give for assigning prices to things. We have gas taxes, so we are trying to, we call this internalizing an externality by raising the price of something, making that external cost internal to the private decision maker. When the price of gas goes up enough, people start driving less. Cigarettes have taxes. Right? There's cigarette taxes as well. So in this case, the government intervention is not causing a market failure per se, it's trying to solve a market failure. The question is, what type of government intervention should we use? Right? What's efficient? Well, we have, I don't know how much Mike talked about this, but the way pollution control started in this country, pretty much in the 70s, and before that as well with respect to water, and that command and control type policy. Okay, this is a policy that imposes a uniform standard on every sort of polluter. Everybody needs to reduce their pollution by the same amount. It's easy to implement. You don't have to think about, you know, why one might be different than the other. The problem with it is that we say it's not efficient. It's not the cheapest way to reduce a certain amount of pollution. Why might that be? Well, it might be that one polluter can reduce a lot more pollution at a lower cost than another one. It might have to do with age, technology, geographical location, a whole bunch of different reasons. It's the same thing if you think about just specialization in your own life. It might make sense to pay somebody to come and watch your kids, or pay someone to cut your lawn instead of doing it yourself. And it benefits you and it benefits the person you hired. It's specialization because somebody can do something at a lower cost. And when I mean lower cost, I mean lower opportunity cost, so that for you to hire a babysitter, you can go to work for the day and earn more money than you're spending on daycare, right? And there's other things associated with that as well. You might want to stay home and spend time with your kid, you know, other reasons as well, but just the general idea of specialization. So what economists did pretty successfully, and I don't know if Mike talked about this, the Clean Air Act. Right? So the Clean Air Act regulated sulfur dioxide emissions. In the 1990 amendments to the Clean Air Act, they established the emissions trading program. Okay, sometimes it's called cap and trade, sometimes it's emissions trading, allowance trading, permit program. They're all essentially the same things. And what they found from that, this is based on sort of economic models of efficiency, and what they found was that it saved a lot of money and actually led to more pollution control. Okay, so and they had a lot more cooperation from businesses that could buy and sell pollution permits. So this was great for anybody. This sort of launched our whole field of environmental economics. It was an amazing model, very innovative, and it's not the only model, though. We have taxes as well, which I just talked about with respect to a gas tax. So the idea behind this is there's something called marginal costs and marginal benefits. Okay, every decision you make is sort of implicitly a comparison of the cost and benefit of doing it, whether it's in financial terms, you know, or whether it's just in time, how much time do you have to spend on something, you know, what do I gain from this versus what does it cost me to do it? If it costs you more than you're going to gain, you probably won't do it if you're what we call rational. But what we want to do is think in terms of marginal costs and marginal benefits. So this is the cost of one more unit, the benefit of one more unit, instead of sort of everything at one time. So the idea being that it's not just the average cost, right? Because marginal costs can be increasing, marginal benefits can be decreasing. Think about an all-you-can-eat buffet, right? You don't go into the buffet saying, I'm going to have 6 plates. You start with 1 plate, the benefit's pretty high. The second plate, the benefit's maybe just as high, maybe a little lower. By the time you get to that 5th or 6th plate, you know, the benefit's much, much smaller until the point where the extra benefit no longer outweighs the extra cost. That's where you decide to stop. Okay, you probably don't think like that, but that's kind of how the model works. And it works with anything, cups of coffee. It works with pollution control, right? So if we think about a pollution control, so whether it's a tax or you have to purchase a permit in order to pollute, the polluter has a choice. As opposed to the command and control policy where you just have to clean up pollution a certain amount or you get fined, in this case you have a choice. For each unit, each ton of pollution that I'm going to reduce, I have a choice. I can either reduce it, which costs me so much in technology and whatever else, or I can just pollute and pay the price, whether that price is buying a permit or paying a tax. That's the comparison that every polluter is going to make with one of these market-based instruments. The point is that they have a choice. And you make the choice depending on which is cheaper, right? And so you keep abating pollution up until the point where it becomes cheaper just to pollute and pay the price of it. If every polluter does that, if every polluter goes along and says, okay, here's the permit price, here's what it costs me to abate, I can make the decision, whatever's cheaper for me. Or if I can clean up, say I can clean up 1 more ton of pollution for $20 per ton. And I have a permit though, but I could sell the permit for $30. You're going to go ahead and clean it up and sell the permit, right? So that's kind of the comparison you're making. If every polluter does that, compares it to the price of the permit at $30 or the tax, you get to a situation where they all will stop abating, where their marginal cost of abatement, the cost of abating or cleaning up 1 more unit, is exactly equal to the price of pollution. That may seem a little abstract right now, but what it does is that ensures that none of these polluters can now reduce pollution cheaper than the other one. Okay, all sort of, we call it the gains from trade or whatever. They've all been exhausted. Nobody can reduce pollution cheaper. This doesn't mean everybody cleans up the same amount or pollutes the same amount. But what it means is that there's no more sort of trading back and forth that can happen to reach an overall lower cost of achieving this amount of pollution control. So it's just the idea that, if one polluter can clean up cheaper than the other polluter, it's going to be more cost effective for them to take on more pollution. Why would they do that? They probably wouldn't voluntarily, but they would if they could sell permits. And they would if they could avoid paying a tax. So the market-based instrument gives them all an incentive to sort of make these decisions. Okay? So you might say, well, it's not fair for one polluter to clean up more than another. Well, it's fair if they're going to, have permit revenue or tax savings from doing it. It's not even a question of fair. They just are going to do that on their own because it's it's their profit-making decision to do that. So that's sort of, really quickly, how the market works with pollution control. I'm going to go into global climate change because a lot of what I just talked about is sort of implemented within the Kyoto Protocol. Okay? And then I'll go back to sort of domestic tools and talk about, I don't want to necessarily try to refute what Mike just told you, but there are, maybe you've already realized as he was talking, there are a lot of concerns about cap and trade. This article actually talks about it. So we can talk about that and how to make it a better program and how it compares to a tax program. But this is not only a domestic problem, it's a global problem. So we have to think about it sort of in the whole global setting. And it's very interesting because the Kyoto Protocol involves a lot of economics. So the way the Kyoto there's a whole, I didn't outline everything of how we got to the Kyoto Protocol, all the points and the stages. But basically what happened in the 90s were rounds of meetings where developed countries agreed to have an international pact on reducing their world's emissions, or reducing each country's emissions. Okay, they had target levels. First, it was going to be about 10% below 1990 levels, and that sort of came and went. So it ended up being about 5% below 1990 levels by target year, which was going to be between 2008 and 2012. Why 1990? Does anyone have any idea? Sorry? Sort of. It was anticipated that it would sort of spike because of the fall of the former Soviet Union, or the Soviet Union. And so all of a sudden we knew Eastern Europe was going to start to develop really quickly. So it was targeted on a significant change in global economic conditions. Whether that's a good baseline now, I don't know. It's become sort of just the accepted baseline because of how it started. I don't know that we should target it. We probably want to target it on overall cumulative CO2. But this is where it's at right now. And if you look through the Lieberman-Warner bill and some of the other Senate bills, they're all targeted to 1990 as well. It's just an accepted standard that we have. So the average reductions of 5% below 1990 levels by 2012. It varied for each country. Developed countries were committed to reducing their emissions. Developing countries, China and India, were signed on but had no binding emissions reduction requirement. So they're signed on to this agreement, but they don't have to reduce their emissions at all. Okay, we'll talk about that in a second. So the big thing when they were under negotiations is that the US dropped out. And the first reaction was, well, this is never going to happen, right? If the US drops out, the leading contributor of greenhouse gas emissions, so the biggest economy, the biggest trade partner for a lot of countries, is not going to happen. But what did happen, well, US and Australia were both out at that time, is the rest of the world said, you know, let's just go ahead, let's go ahead with this. And what they needed were countries representing 55% of the world's emissions without the US, which at the time was about 25%. So they still needed a lot. They had all kinds of negotiations. You know, Russia said, we'll join if you get us into the WTO, and, you know, all these kind of political things that happened. Also, what had to happen is the emissions reductions, reducing your emissions to 5% below 1990 levels is a lot, because they're actually, in most developed countries, they were increasing, right? Not even decreasing. So getting it below would be very hard. What they were fighting about was countries like Canada, Russia, Japan. They wanted credit for sort of removing CO2 from the atmosphere. So not in terms of emissions reductions, but planting trees to take CO2 out. They did that, you get credit towards your emissions reduction goal. European countries didn't like that because there's very little land to do that with in Europe. But after the US dropped out, they relented, the European Union relented, Canada was able to get credit for that, and other countries as well. So what happened is the Kyoto Protocol was ratified. It went into effect, I want to say 1997, but I don't remember exactly. Australia just signed. You know, there's no way they're going to meet their goals by, 5 years from now, but Australia signed down with a new leadership. But the main concern for the US was that the developing countries have no binding requirements. And we're looking at China growing at 10, 11% per year. India is about 8 or 9% per year. How do they not control their emissions when the rest of us have to? So, there's a lot of questions about that. Why is that the case? I'm going to talk about that in a second. And then I think you'll hear more about it as you hear more about China as we go along. So this is the Kyoto Protocol. Right now we're in a stage where everyone's trying to figure out what do we do next, because we're coming up on the expiration of the Kyoto Protocol. We still are debating global policy. We still don't know if the US is going to participate. We don't know if developing countries, are we going to come to another agreement if developing countries have no emissions reduction requirement? Probably not, but are China and India going to sign on if they do have requirements? Russia's already said we don't want any part of this. Russia was able to comply very easily because their economy sort of collapsed and slowed down quite a bit. So this is an example. This is Canada. So you can see where they were, in about 2000, I guess 2004, 2005. Actually, it's probably higher than that now. If they wanted to meet their Kyoto target, that's what it would have to look like, their greenhouse gas emissions. That's pretty much impossible, right? If you want to keep functioning as humanity, I guess. But that's not going to happen. So acknowledging that, the Kyoto Protocol has some flexibility mechanisms built in, or some market-based instruments. The first one I already mentioned, that Canada, well, maybe you can't reduce your emissions. You can't meet your target by reducing emissions, so instead you can plant trees. Take sort of, I worked on a project in Canada when I used to be up at University of British Columbia where we looked at farms, and there's a lot of farmland, what we call marginal farmland. Land that requires a lot of tillage, a lot of fertilizer use. It's just basically not very productive farmland. It also releases a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. How much would we have to, as a government, how much would it cost to pay farmers to take that land out of production and plant trees on it? Okay, so you hear a lot more about this now because, we're talking about restoration of cropland and that. How much would it cost to do that? And so the idea is you reduce emissions plus you sequester carbon. You take it out of the atmosphere. And how much credit do you get for that? That was an interesting project. I can talk more about it later. But then there's emissions trading, which at the European Union emissions trading system. Did Mike talked about that, I assume, a little bit? Okay, so the only mandatory carbon trading market we have is in Europe right now, is under the Kyoto Protocol. The climate exchange here is voluntary. There's a big difference between voluntary and mandatory. Carbon permits trade at about $40 a ton in Europe, and they trade about, I don't know, what is that now, $5, $6, $7? So that's a big difference, sort of the mandatory versus voluntary approach to it. Joint implementation is something where you can get credit for emissions reduction in another country, but this is joint implementation means between two developed countries. So Canada could engage in projects in Japan, for example. This is the big one, the Clean Development Mechanism. Talk about this a little bit. This is how China and India are involved. Developed countries, the European Union, Canada, they can get credit towards their emissions targets by paying for pollution control in China and in India. Okay? And I'll talk more about that in a second. That's how we get the developed countries involved. Why would Canada do that as opposed to reducing their own emissions? Any ideas?
Cheaper.
It's cheaper, right? So let's exhaust all the cheap stuff first and then get to the more expensive stuff. So we know how to, remove CFCs, for example. We did this under the Montreal Protocol in most developing countries. That's something we can do very cheaply. It's a lot cheaper than, putting solar panels on all your buildings. So Canada can go into China, get rid of those at a much cheaper cost than they can in their own country. So what is the rationale for this? This is sort of a theory from development economics, development and environment economics that has some merit for what's happened in the past. There's a lot of questions about it now, but it's thought to be this relationship between environmental degradation, you can think of just pollution, so environmental quality, pollution levels, and per capita income of a country. So as a country is way down here, right, they're at some low level of pollution. That's a country that's relying on subsistence agriculture, there's no manufacturing, there's very little industry. As this country starts to increase its income, you can think of Eastern Europe as a good example, you can think of the Industrial Revolution. As you start to move from that to manufacturing and to growing economies, more people start driving, all of these things, pollution starts to go up. At some point, though, there's a turning point, and pollution goes down. In wealthier nations, people care more about the environment. You can afford technology. You can basically afford pollution control. So we see it go down. This is a path that Eastern Europe or the US took. But the question about this is, this is sort of the rationale. Let China and India develop. Let them get to a point where they can pay for pollution control. But this depends on a couple things. And there's some argument that this doesn't really exist anymore, or doesn't exist in this case, because one, the type of pollutant matters. So if we're talking about greenhouse gases or CO2, there's a lot of countries down here with very high greenhouse gas emissions from deforestation. Okay? So maybe this relationship doesn't hold for CO2. Okay? And if you look at wealthier countries like the US, are we, down there? We're decreasing, but are we down there? Probably not. Globalization, right? For better or worse, globalization does have its benefits. One is that why should China follow the same path as the US towards industrialization? We can pay for pollution, the developed world can pay for pollution control. We have technology, we can do it very cheaply. So why should countries develop along the same path that they did hundreds of years ago, 50 years ago even, right? That's the idea there. Outsourced pollution. So one way that countries were able to reduce their pollution as they became richer is they basically shipped their pollution to developing countries, right? But as these countries start to develop, there's fewer places to ship it to, right? So we don't really have this sort of option anymore. So there's a lot of people that think, oh, this curve doesn't look like this anymore. It's flatter. Or maybe it's even, it's inverted. It's an actual U. where you see deforestation as countries, that have a heavy deforestation, as they start to develop and move away from agriculture, that you see them decline, the emissions decline because you're no longer clearing forest land for agriculture. Okay? So this is the premise, anyway, for why India and China have no emissions reductions requirement. This is the big thing right now, is the clean development mechanism. It's very innovative, okay, in the sense that, well, we want to let countries develop. We don't want to restrict them too much, or they will never be able to get rid of poverty and things like that. So what it does is it allows emissions reductions in developing countries, encourages pollution control, and it gives rich countries or developed countries an incentive to do that. Right? So if you can't reduce, like we were just saying, it's cheaper to go into China and upgrade the refrigerant plants than it is to cut airline emissions in the European Union. So in this case, the developed countries have an incentive. They get credits for it. And with the emissions trading program in Europe, you can go down to China or Africa or India, and for maybe €1 per ton of carbon abated, it'll cost you. You can go back to the European market and sell that credit for $40 a ton, or whatever. So the credit's worth a lot more than the actual cost of reducing carbon. So there's an incentive to do it. It allows pollution control in developing countries. This is, it's a really remarkable way to do this. It's emissions trading. It's cost effective. It's one of the sort of great economic success stories. But it's got some problems, which maybe you've already kind of come up with some in your mind. What we've seen is that there have been tremendous investment within the clean development mechanism. I think on the European exchange, they're limited 20% of their emissions reductions can come from this. The rest you have to do within your own country. But what we're seeing is that these projects are starting to diminish. The opportunities are starting to dwindle because we're starting to exhaust sort of the cheaper options. Under an emissions trading market, this should work, that once we've exhausted the cheap options, the price of the permit goes up, and then you have to start investing in sort of more things that become more attractive as the price goes up. But what we're finding is that, it's going to run out. So what are the concerns about this? Something in economics we call moral hazard. Moral hazard is the idea that the policy or the program gives you the opposite incentive of what was intended. So the idea is like health insurance. Okay, so maybe you don't have health insurance. You decide, well, I'm not going to, or I don't have car insurance, let's say. I'm not going to drive that recklessly. I don't have health insurance. I'm not going to go bungee jumping. But once you get insurance, you're insured against that, then you take on riskier behavior. Right? So the idea is that you you reduce your risk when you're not insured, but as soon as you get insurance, you're able to be a little more reckless. That's one example of moral hazard. The big problem here is what we call additionality. So let's take the refrigerant example. We've sort of removed CFCs very successfully under a program called the Montreal Protocol in the developed countries. The other countries are still working on it. So China is still working on this. Investment comes in through the developed countries under the Montreal Protocol. It's going to happen anyway, is the point, right? But now they're waiting on it. They're waiting on it. China will wait on this. They'll even generate new CFCs because they can get Europe to pay for it, right? And they figured this out, so they started taxing clean development mechanism programs. So for every investment, Europe comes into China, cleans up. The Chinese government gets revenue from that. So they have an incentive to create more pollution. Or to wait, to not do anything on their own because somebody else will pay for it. So this is something that was recognized, additionality, and that the UN modified the rules of the clean development mechanisms to say you have to make sure your projects bring about new emissions reductions. Okay, so the Chicago Climate Exchange, one of their offset providers, no-till agriculture in Iowa. Okay, so what's to say that wouldn't have happened anyway, right? We want to make sure that we're having new emissions reductions, not just having people wait to get paid for it on things they would have done on their own. Example, the MTA in New York, the Transit Authority. They want to calculate all their emissions reductions from providing public transportation and get paid for it. Right, but that's happening anyway. It's not like they're going to shut down. So we have to be really careful about trying to reduce new emissions reductions, or we're never going to start increasing our emissions reductions. So what we call moral hazard is that this additionality, this thing, it reduces the incentive to voluntarily reduce your emissions or to invest in cleaner technology if you're waiting for someone else to pay for it. Or you expect you're going to get paid for reducing carbon, you're going to wait till you can do that. It's very simple. Why would you spend money on something when you know somebody else would do it, right? So the Clean Development Mechanism, the rules were modified. It's still sort of a big problem. And related to that, where do we go next from this? Well, one thing is the Clean Development Mechanism, right now it's sort of one-by-one abatement projects. Because of the new rules for this additionality problem, each one has to be reviewed, audited, checked. A lot of them are rejected because they're not deemed new emissions reductions. That's very costly, right? And it's very time-consuming. So one argument is like keep the clean development mechanism, but target it towards sustainable development projects, things that are more long-term investments, things that you will see actual changes happen, structural changes happen, rather than one-by-one plant upgrades or things like that. So, I'm sorry?
Could you give an example?
Yeah, so one might be like a big solar project to invest a lot of money in developing solar panels or new hydroelectric projects, things that have long-term potential that would be used for, they won't just be done real quickly, just to make money off of, okay? Things that have significant upfront costs that you have to wait a while to get the returns, the type of thing. So what do we do? Well, what is the future of global climate policy? I mean, I don't want to be pessimistic, which it kind of sounds like, but this is a global problem, right? And the Kyoto Protocol was really remarkable in the way and the amount of cooperation that was, put together internationally without the U.S. participation. So where do we go from here? Well, what is the role of developing countries? The U.S. is not the only one now saying something's got to happen in the developing world. The growth rate in CO2 emissions in these countries is so much higher than in the developed world. China, according to some estimates, is now the world's leader in CO2 emissions, has overtaken the U.S. If it hasn't, it will very soon. But the argument from developing countries is like, the problem with greenhouse gases is the concentrations, the cumulative amount that's in the atmosphere that's happened over a much longer time period. And if you look at that, the U.S. is responsible for a lot more than China, for example. And that's really what we're concerned with. So you hear a lot about climate mitigation and climate adaptation. Mitigation is the idea that we reduce our emissions. And there's some people saying we can cut up all our CO2 emissions right now and we still haven't gotten rid of the problem, right? So, we have to think about adaptation. Per capita emissions, anything per capita in China is going to be much smaller. So what happens now? Well, we've got this issue where countries, or you can look at it at a city level, a company level, they don't want to act alone, right? Nobody really wants to be the first to do something because they're not sure what's going to happen. This idea of free riders is another economic concept, and I'm sure that you've all heard of, used free riders before in other contexts, is that it's a global problem. So anyone who reduces their CO2 emissions, we all benefit from that. Okay, we don't all bear the costs of reducing the CO2 emissions, though. So if a country has an incentive to just kind of wait and see what everyone else is going to do, or just let other people pay for it and do it, that's an issue that we have to take into consideration. Another sort of interesting concept from economics is this notion of the prisoner's dilemma. So this comes from this model, just very basically, where there's two prisoners that have been, they've been captured, they've been accused of a crime together, they're put in separate cells. They can't communicate at all. The detectives come in and try to get one to implicate the other. They want them both to implicate the other. If neither one implicates, they say, okay, if neither of you admit to, that the other one did it, you get 1 year in jail each. Okay, if one of you turns the other one in, but the other person doesn't do so, well, the one who implicated the other goes free, and the person who didn't say anything gets 10 years. Okay, because they never admitted. The third option is they both turn each other in and they each get 5 years. So what's happening here is each prisoner is trying to figure out what the other one's going to do, but they can't communicate with them. So the rational argument is they both turn each other in and they both get 5 years. Whether or not that happens, there's this debate of what's that person going to do. You base it on what you know about that person. You base it on your risk of getting 10 years versus 5 versus 1. That's the prisoner's, very simply, that's the prisoner's dilemma in economics. That's something that, you know, people are saying is happening with global climate change. Every entity is hedging on other people's behavior, trying to figure out what someone else is going to do. And there's this complication because we have free riders, right? You can, you know, arguably, you can do nothing and really reap benefits from this problem. So, the good thing about this, though, is that this is not a one-time problem. This is an ongoing game, if you will, where, you know, we went through one round, we're going to go through another round, so we learn information, and we could set up the Kyoto Protocol so we do it every year instead of every 5 years, so that after a certain amount of time, if most countries sign and other ones do not, then maybe they can, you know, collude together to punish the ones that are not doing what they need to do. So there's a lot of political arguments in here. It's something to take into consideration, though, with respect to how are we going to have some kind of global agreement that doesn't encourage sort of gaming and, you know, this kind of political behavior. So where are we domestically? Well, we don't have, I guess you probably already know this, but we don't have any sort of federal regulation of greenhouse gases, right? Lieberman-Warner just went through the Senate, was rejected. There's a lot of problems with that bill. And it's interesting that as gas prices go up, it's going to be a lot harder to pass climate legislation. So, you know, we've got all kinds of, some people say the targets in Lieberman-Warner are not strict enough. The cap and trade program is flawed because, I'll get into a little bit later, but you're going to give away all the permits for free, or most of the permits for free. That's different than selling pollution permits to start. So regionally, we're seeing a lot of agreements. So we're seeing, I don't know if you heard about this or not yet, but there's a West Coast agreement. California came up with statewide laws. And there's a Western Climate Initiative that's set up between West Coast states and a couple of provinces in Canada. There's the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in the East Coast that's going to mimic the Clean Air Act. It's just going to be power companies, and they're going to trade, cap and trade program. The Midwest governors just signed an agreement. Okay, all these agreements are signed. Nothing's actually happened yet. But states, California, Illinois is talking about regulating greenhouse gases. Cities, there's a mayor's climate agreement. Over 800 some cities have signed on to meet or beat the Kyoto targets. How are they doing this? Somebody asked what Chicago was doing. No, I'm not really sure. One of the complications with the climate exchange is that Chicago can sign on and just offset all their emissions, right? They can just pay $7 a ton, meet their agreements, and not actually do anything within the city. That's one of the problems with it. And it's going to be a problem as long as it's voluntary, right? So, but there's a lot of action happening. There's a lot of action happening in private industry. So in the absence of federal regulation, you know, we are seeing a lot of initiative that's coming from other places. Setting carbon prices, again, in theory, cap and trade sets the quantity of emissions, okay, and the permit price is what changes. A carbon tax just sets the price, and the quantity varies. In theory, they should do the exact same thing. Okay, in reality, they don't because of a lot of reasons. The difference is, I think Mike talked about this, downstream on emissions. A cap and trade program is a permit for per ton of emissions, or per 1,000 ton of emissions. It's downstream, meaning it's the end use of the fossil fuel. An upstream carbon tax is on carbon content. So when you purchase coal from the mine head, when you purchase oil, when the refinery purchases oil, the tax is on the carbon content of the fuel. The difference is, on emissions, everybody has CO2 emissions. Just sitting in this room, we have CO2 emissions, right? So there's a lot more entities you have to deal with. Upstream on carbon content, there's, you know, much fewer. You have to deal with oil refineries and whoever purchases the coal, the energy companies. And, you know, it doesn't make any difference. They're still going to pass that on. Everyone's going to pass it on as much as they can to consumers, right? Or, you know, however much can be passed on. The problem is that there's a lot of uncertainty. Cap and trade and carbon tax are equivalent in theory. You know, I teach this in my class, and you can draw the graph and show, oh, they do the exact same thing. Well, there's a lot of uncertainty here. Uncertainty in the costs of abatement, uncertainty in the benefits. In the European trading market, they gave out way too many permits the first time, so the price of the permit fell to zero, and nobody traded. Second time around, they got it a little bit, they got it better, and it's working quite well, but there's a lot of uncertainty. how much should a carbon tax be? Well, you could look at, how much more does coal have to cost you before people switch to wind or solar? You could kind of target it that way. But again, a lot of uncertainty. Look at our whole biofuel program, right? I don't know if that was uncertainty or what it was, but there's a lot of problems with that. So let me just say a few words about this. And how much time do I have, Jamie?
15 minutes.
Okay, perfect. So I think you heard a lot about the advantages of emissions trading, so I'm going to leave that for the last hour. But I think like I said, it's an incredibly innovative program that has been one of the great economic success stories. So as economists who work in environmental policy, we will go back to the Clean Air Act and say, look how well this worked at reducing costs and reducing pollution. Tremendous advantages. I think we can make it better. So as you read this article that you were just given, and a lot of articles right now after the Lieberman-Warner bill didn't pass, a lot of economists are saying, well, this has so many problems, let's go to a carbon tax. So let's just quickly talk about both. These are two quotes that I just pulled out. There's a lot of quotes like this right now after the Senate bill, but the chief political virtue of cap and trade is its complexity, or the idea that it's complicated and conveniently opaque. So one of the arguments is that this does the same thing as a carbon tax, but people hear tax, and they think my energy prices are going up, my electricity bill is going up, my gas prices are going up. The same thing is going to happen with cap and trade, but people don't necessarily know that or understand that, which, is that a good thing or not a bad thing? You kind of want to know what's going to happen. You've got the additionality problem, which I talked about with the clean development mechanism. You've got the same problem here. How do we know that people wouldn't have engaged in pollution control projects already because there were private benefits from doing so? This is the biggest problem. How do you give out the permits? Under the Clean Air Act, they were just given out, which is essentially like giving out cash. That's why you see so many private companies lobbying for cap and trade, because they want to be given a certain number of permits. That's why you see companies that are engaging in pollution control early, because then when they get the permits, they can sell them. Both, let's see, the Lieberman-Warner Act argued that some of the permits should be sold instead of given out for free, so that, in a sense, you're making polluters pay to pollute. The Obama plan is 100% auction instead of giving anyway for free. I think McCain is 30% auction, maybe, and it increases over time. Yeah?
What's the rationale for giving any of them free? I don't care.
Well, the argument is if you make them, if you all of a sudden make industry pay for pollution, that's going to just increase costs so quickly and so substantially that our energy, electric bills, and everything's going to go through the roof. Right? So you want to sort of phase it, and you want to give them some time. So the idea is you give some out for free. The next phase, you start selling a bigger proportion. You start selling another bigger proportion. If you give them out for free, it's a real boon to industry. They're going to make a lot of money and probably pass on the cost. So there's a lot of discussion about not giving it out for free anymore.
So auction is like an in-between choice. So it's not free, but it's not set.
Well, 100% auction is sort of the other extreme. They're all sold. It's basically mimics the carbon tax.
But they're sold at whatever price they can get, not at a specific price.
Well, they're sold at an initial price that the government sets, and then that's the starting point, and the price goes up and down as they start trading. Yeah. So the problem with the cap and trade is that, and the carbon tax has the opposite problem, but the quantity of emissions is fixed, right, by however many permits are given out or sold. The price is what's uncertain. So like I said, the price in the European exchange, the permit price went to 0. If you gave too few permits, the price could skyrocket. This has a couple of problems in that it's hard to invest in sort of energy efficiency upgrades or renewable energy if you don't know what the future price of pollution is going to be. So that's the uncertainty. The good thing about it is that you've fixed the quantity of emissions reductions. You know exactly how much pollution is going to be out there, assuming that it's all monitored and that. What's being proposed is what's called a safety valve. So if the permit price gets too high, at like $50 a ton, it's capped. It stays at $50 a ton. That sort of takes care of this problem a little bit, but then you're sort of fixing quantity and price where you lose a lot of the market nature of it. Yeah?
Do you think selling futures on these emission trades is a wise idea?
Well, that's something Mike knows a lot more about than I do, but we're seeing what happens with futures on oil right now. So, yeah, I don't know. Anytime you set up a market like that, though, there is going to be that speculation aspect of it. And what the next thing that I was going to just talk about is that you've got fixed emissions. This is related to your question. So that this is good in the sense that you're controlling the amount of emissions, but you can't adjust that for differences in business cycles. So if we're going into a recession, emissions naturally go down. If we have a boom, emissions actually go up. Do you want to be able to adjust the amount of pollution for that? Maybe, maybe not. One way that we're dealing with this is you can bank permits and use them later. So you can bank them thinking, oh, well, the price of them is going to go way up in the future. I'm going to save them for later. As more and more people start banking, the price is going to go up because there's fewer available in the market. So there's a lot of these things can actually adjust the cap and trade program. What some people say is, why are you adjusting it to make it just like a carbon tax? So let's talk about that for a second. Are there any examples of a carbon tax? Mike makes a really good point that this is maybe a non-issue because we'll never get it passed, right? Politically, you just can't say the word tax. I could sit up here all day and talk about it as the same thing as a cap and trade, but you can't say tax. So then people start saying, well, if you don't tax pollution, you're subsidizing pollution, or call it a price correction, call it a removal of a pollution subsidy, whatever you want to call it. There's a few examples. The city of Boulder, the San Francisco Bay Area, starting on July 1st, they're at like 4 cents a ton. Okay, so again, nobody wants to be the first to have like a real carbon tax. British Columbia, the province of British Columbia is starting a real carbon tax. It's going to be the first one that we're going to see. You can imagine how much opposition they're getting, but they're going to try it. And what they're going to do with it, I'll go through these advantages and tell you in a second. Here's some things about it. It's upstream. Again, it's easier. You only have a few people or a few industries that you have to put the tax on. It's still passed on. It's still passed on to consumers. The Congressional Budget Office did a study and found that it's actually 5 times more effective than an inflexible cap and trade program. That means a cap and trade program without the safety valve, without the banking. You can modify cap and trade to make it almost as efficient. Fewer administrative costs. You don't have to go out and monitor and audit all of your offset providers to make sure there are new emissions reductions. But you sort of lose that clean development mechanism aspect. You could still funnel money from the tax revenue to China, but again, politically, that's hard to do. Price certainty. You know the price of pollution. What is the price of a permit going to be? We're not sure. The carbon tax is set, $30 a ton. You know what it's going to be in the future. That allows less volatility for long-term investment. Everybody wants, if you're going to have any kind of long-term investment, pollution control or not, you want to know sort of what your minimum return is going to be. You don't know that if you don't know the price of carbon. Okay, so but what happens is that you've got quantity uncertainty, which I'll talk about in a second. This is what British Columbia is doing. This is the argument that it is a concern, right? If the government, all the money goes to the government now, which would happen, the same thing would happen if you auctioned pollution permits. But what's the government going to do with the money, right? Waste a lot of it, probably. So one of the arguments is revenue neutrality, a tax swap. So return the revenue from the carbon tax by offsetting payroll taxes, or putting it to sort of low-income people who won't be able to afford to pay electricity bills, things like that. British Columbia is returning all of the tax revenue in terms of payroll deductions, corporate tax deductions. So you're taxing pollution and offsetting income taxes, taxing pollution and not work. Whether or not that's going to work is another question, but that's a big argument that you could do with that. Concerns about carbon taxes is we don't know the quantity of emissions reduction. You can guess based on the price, but it's not guaranteed. That's not as big a concern if you don't have a threshold. So we're concerned about cumulative CO2. If we get the quantity off a little bit, is that as big a deal as if we were talking about toxic waste or something? I don't know. It will be at some point, probably. Here's your biggest problem: support. As I mentioned, I do some advising for one of the political campaigns, and they're like, don't even say carbon tax. We understand it. We understand why it's great. We can't go out there and say tax. So, some people have. There's actually quite a few politicians that are kind of jumping on board. Bloomberg came out and said, we need a nationwide carbon tax, but we're not going to do it just in New York. Everyone has to do it. Right? So I don't know that anyone's done the study to look at the impact of a citywide carbon tax. I keep pushing Chicago to do it, but we'll see. These are the biggest problems. This is a big problem, though. political palatability. You think that's something that could possibly change, but if there's no political support for it, it's essentially a non-issue. This is a Congressional Budget Office study. This is the relative efficiency, if this is the base level. That's the tax, 5 times as efficient as an inflexible cap. But once you modify the cap and trade program and you allow banking, you allow selling of the permits and the safety valve, you can make it almost as efficient as a tax. Okay, so it's possible. There's still all these problems that there's this room for gaming and lobbying and all this stuff that goes on, but there are ways to modify it. So, I have what, 5 minutes? Yeah. Okay. So real quickly, I'm probably not going to have much time to go into all this. Regardless, you know, I think all agree, or most people agree, that we want a carbon price. Regardless of how we get there, what happens? What's going to happen if we start pricing carbon? Well, we're going to have a supply response, right? Increased price of fossil fuel-based inputs is going to lead to substitution. How much substitution depends on you know, the costs of alternatives and the infrastructure. So we can say, well, we're going to switch as much as we can to wind and solar, but we still have to think about how we're going to, first of all, we're going to put the wind turbines. We have to put in the transmission lines. There's a lot of infrastructure here. So, you know, in Germany, for example, they subsidized solar like crazy. And what happened is they ran out of inputs. The silicon they needed to produce the solar panels because people were moving to solar so quickly that the price of solar skyrocketed, which was the exact opposite of what they wanted. And now they have all the solar technology in Germany where they don't have much sun. So you have to be really careful about how much you push for alternatives without the infrastructure, without the availability of raw materials. Ethanol is a classic example, right? Corn-based ethanol. Demand response. So as the price of energy goes up, the amount consumed goes down. Right, it's pretty rigid, right? If you look at gas prices, and it had to go pretty high pretty quickly to see changes being made. But there's a lot of gains to be made here in energy efficiency. The question then is, how do you reduce carbon emissions? If the price goes up, we know we want some combination of things. Generally, people will go for the cheapest option. What we're finding is that that's not really happening. Real quickly, I'll just show you 2 more slides. There's a couple things you can do on the supply side. Fix coal. We have a lot of coal, right? And the thing to be concerned about is that India and China have a tremendous amount of coal reserves. So, and we have the infrastructure to use coal. So it's going to be really hard to switch away from coal, okay? You know, and it's cheap. Right now it's cheap. We have all these other options. Clean coal, scrubbing the coal emissions so that the CO2 doesn't get released. Carbon capture, capturing the CO2 and burying it underground. This FutureGen project, which you probably have heard about, was supposed to be in here in Illinois, Mattoon, Illinois, which captures the carbon, buries it underground, deep enough underground that turns it into liquid, so it can't really escape. But at about $800 million costs, when they started working on the plans, that went up to about almost $2 billion in costs, and it got shelved by the federal government. So this is, if you can look, this is our energy mix right now. You see renewables is the dark brown, and you can barely see it at the top there. So we talk a lot about wind and solar. We have tremendous growth in wind and solar, but guess what? It's about 1%, a little over 1%. The projection is by 2030 that it'll double, so it'll double to about 2.5%. So you can see that, you know, we've got to push it a little harder in terms of pricing carbon or, you know, offering subsidies or whatever the case may be. The other thing we're talking about a lot now with oil is increasing our domestic supply of oil. These are all controversial enough, so I kind of just leave it at that. The last thing I wanted to say, what the estimates are that if a carbon price of at least $30 a ton, not $7, $30 a ton, will make wind energy and coal carbon capture viable. We've also got this other thing, nuclear, right, which is clean. But we've got all kinds of issues related to nuclear as well. There's tremendous potential, but whether or not, again, we're going to go that way is another question. On the demand side, I'll just quickly say that the other problem we have is not only are we trying to reduce our emissions, that we've got increasing demand for energy. Okay, so it's kind of going in the opposite direction. Increasing supply of renewables, it's not enough. So what do we have on the demand side? Well, if you look at buildings, for example, this is what the cities are dealing with. 70% greenhouse gas emissions in urban areas come from buildings. half of U.S. energy consumption, 70% of electricity use. A recent report by McKinsey finds that this actually is improving energy efficiency is the cheapest way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. There are all kinds of stats related to this. At a household level, though, it's just not really happening very well. But there's a tremendous amount of potential, huge rates of return. Why is it not happening? There's a lot of different reasons. This is the example showing this is the cheap stuff. This is the stuff that not only is it cheap, it'll save you money. This is the cost of a carbon abatement, CO2 abatement. These are buildings, right? It's going to save you money to invest in energy efficiency. The problem is it's going to save you money over time. So this is the last thing I'll say. I have more on this, but I know my time's up. So, do higher energy prices, does a carbon price lead to energy efficient investments? There are still potential barriers that we need to work on. The main thing is that it requires an upfront investment, and then you have to wait for a return. Something as simple as a light bulb. You know, it costs a couple dollars more. So are you going to wait for the return on that? You know, some people might just not have the money. I mean, that's just a light bulb. You can talk about water heaters and furnaces and appliances. Are you going to live in your place long enough to realize the returns on it? Are you aware of the returns? You know, there's a lot of questions with, and this is not only at an individual level. This is at a business level. This is at a legislator level, right? You spend a lot of money today, and the returns don't happen for long periods of time. That's kind of an issue. Second thing, principal agent problems. This is the idea with the buildings in particular. Do the person paying the electricity bills, is that the person who's, you know, that's not the developer. That's not the person who's designing the building. That can be linked together through demand, you know, if people start demanding sort of greener buildings. But that's another thing to consider. Hidden costs of substitutes. Does the, you know, compact fluorescent light bulb give off the same type of light as the old bulbs? It used to be, you know, people, you know, we saw the hybrid cars, the Prius. Nobody's going to trade in their SUV for a Prius, or not many people. But they might trade in their SUV for a hybrid SUV. So that's kind of changing. This is a big problem, information and transaction costs. There's a lot of information out there. I'm not saying it's necessarily good information, but you can pick up anything and read about eco this or eco that. The New York Times last week called it green noise, right? So there's a lot of movement in every direction, but are we actually going anywhere? The same problem is that, you know, similar problem is that we have just too little information. People don't have like smart meters in their houses. They don't know exactly what they're paying for energy, how much they're using for different appliances. So there's a lot here. These are all potential barriers to energy efficiency. I can talk more about that afterwards if somebody wants to, but sorry I took up all the time.
I put in all new windows in my house, I put in a new air conditioner, a new furnace, I put in layers of insulation, I did all those things. But what I've never been able to figure out is if you look at the cost of the production of all of those things and the transportation and the resource use, was it more energy efficient to do those things or to just pay a higher fee? You know, and in terms of the carbon use too.
Right, that's a good question. I mean, people are talking about carbon labels and carbon footprints, and so, you know, the question is, do I buy if I live in New York State, do I buy the locally grown apple, or do I buy the organically produced apple that came from Washington State? You know, what's the overall carbon? And I don't know that there's any good way to sort of measure that. And, you know, it might be that you start replacing things at the end of the life of the last one, right? Because you have to replace it anyway. So maybe that's more effective than just going out and trying to replace everything at one time. You know, it's a good question, though.
Thinking of international rather than national cap and trade systems, I can't figure out how the whole system wouldn't be totally undermined by the fact that China and India have such huge populations and such great poverty. If you took every single corporation in the United States and Europe, and each one paid a lot of money to an equal number of corporations in China not to pollute, there would still be so many other corporations in China left that were never touched because the population is so fantastically large that those other ones would still put out enough pollution to carry us into over the top.
Yeah. Yeah, I know there's a lot of discussion over whatever we could do in the developed world is just going to be overwhelmed by what happens in the developing world. regardless of investment in that. I think you're our next speaker, right? So you'll talk about China in more detail with respect to those issues. Okay.
If you go back to you had a graph of the different energy choices over the years.
This one?
No, the one before that.
Sorry, it's slow.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's on this week's Economist.
Yeah, that's where I got it.
And what's amazing to me is it took 50 years from 1850 to 1900 for us to actually stop getting to use wood so much. And then it took 50 years from us to go to 1900 to 1950 to do the same thing with coal. Do you think the one thing we need to give ourselves now is just patience and time? I mean, we're sometimes a culture who, when we see a problem, we want to change it right away. Otherwise, we get frustrated and we say, why aren't things being done? And why aren't big companies the problem? I mean, we blame everybody and we want to change right away. Do you see patience and time and tenacity and persistence as requirements as well to try to get this problem solved?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. And I think things are happening. The push towards renewables is a lot faster now, but it's just what I was talking about with the high discount rates. It's like we want to see things happen right away. We don't want to wait for long periods of return. But we can't, a lot of this we can't rush if we don't have the infrastructure and raw materials to do so. The ethanol is the classic example. We did that really quickly, the corn-based ethanol. And that, you can say food prices and that, it's not all attributable to corn-based ethanol. It might not even be, substantially attributable. But there's so many other things going on that you have to take into account as you push towards one thing really quickly. So, yeah, I think, the problem with time and patience is that people's focus changes and legislators change and, business objectives change, and so.
But I feel like we're in the field of education. I mean, that's what we bank on. We invest in the future. Right? So it's, I guess, our job to make sure we're raising kids who have that lifestyle of looking at it.
Asking the question, how much time do you think we have? According to scientists, we don't have more than 10 or 15 years before the tipping points are all reached and we're out of control.
Right, so.
I think that part of the fear is that, the famine is going on right now, right? The loss of crop fields and people are suffering, so.
So maybe our focus should be on adaptation right now. That's a good question. Thank you
Thank you so much.